A waitress hears something no one else at the table catches. The translator is lying. Every word out of his mouth is poison. He's turning a $40 million deal into a disaster, and the CEO sitting across from him has no idea. She's a single mother making $11 an hour. She has no business speaking up, no safety net if she's wrong. But she knows German, fluently, perfectly, because of a life she was forced to leave behind. She steps forward and says what no one expects. Within 24 hours, she'll lose her job for it. Within 2 weeks, she'll be sitting in a boardroom. And this time, her name will be on the chair. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, have you ever spoken up when staying quiet would have been easier? I want to hear that story. The tips came out to $47. Elena Vasquez counted them twice at the service station, smoothing each bill flat before folding them into her back pocket. 9 hours on her feet, $47. She didn't do the math on the hourly anymore. She'd stopped that habit the same month she'd started patching her shoe sole with dollar store glue. Brannigan Steakhouse was emptying out. The last 4 top had settled their check, leaving behind wadded napkins and a single untouched bread roll that Elena wrapped and slipped into her apron. Sophia liked the bread rolls. She wiped the last table, ignored Carlos in the kitchen, making a joke she didn't want to hear, and stepped into the back alley. It smelled like grease and dumpster water, but it was quiet, and quiet was the only luxury Elena could afford. She sat on the milk crate she'd claimed months ago and pulled a worn paperback from her apron. Goody. The binding held together with packing tape, the cover soft as cloth from years of handling. She read the German silently, lips barely moving, the syllables settling into her chest like a language her body remembered even when the rest of her life had forgotten it. Girl, you and that foreign book. Danielle leaned out the back door, box braids swinging, already swapping her black shoes for bright orange sneakers. Every single night. Elena smiled without looking up. It relaxes me. You know what relaxes me? Not being here. Danielle grinned and disappeared inside. Elena closed the book and called Sophia. The babysitter's phone, really, but Sophia always answered at this hour. Mama, Ms. Patterson said the field trip is $35. She said we need it by Friday. Elena closed her eyes. $35. She had $640 in checking, rent was $1,100, and the electric bill sat unopened on the counter. We'll figure out the field trip, Mija. We always figure it out. A pause. Then, can you sing the German song? Elena leaned her head against the brick wall and sang softly into the phone. The lullaby was old, something she'd learned in a university classroom that felt like another life, from a professor who'd once told her she had the best ear for German he'd encountered in 30 years. She sang it the way she sang it every night, quietly, precisely, like placing something fragile on a shelf where it couldn't be broken. Sophia's breathing slowed. Elena whispered goodnight and hung up. The woman who'd earned a full scholarship to study German literature at UNC Charlotte. 8 credits from graduating when her mother's diagnosis turned the future into hospital bills and impossible choices. A husband, Miguel, who fell from scaffolding 3 years ago and left behind a daughter, medical debt, and a silence that never went away. She stood, brushed off her slacks, and walked back inside. The hostess caught her at the service station. Heads up. Big private party booked the back room tomorrow night. Some CEO hosting a German businessman. Elena paused. Something flickered through her. Not hope. Not exactly. More like recognition. The feeling of hearing a door open in a house you thought was locked. German? She said. Yeah, Rick's freaking out about the wine list. Elena nodded and clocked out. She drove home through the dark streets of Charlotte, the worn Goethe on the passenger seat beside her, and felt the flicker again, small and unnamed and impossible to ignore. The private dining room had wood-paneled walls, an unpolished brass chandelier, and a long table that Rick Tavares had set with the restaurant's best linens, still creased from 6 months in storage. Elena arrived early, straightened the silverware, and filled every glass to the same level. David Harmon arrived first. Tall, lean, wire-framed glasses, no watch, no cufflinks. He sat reviewing a leather folder and barely acknowledged Elena. She didn't take it personally. She'd been invisible in this room 100 times. Marcus Keller arrived next, charcoal suit cut like a second skin, tag Heuer on his wrist that he touched while shaking David's hand. He smiled wide and often and pulled out the chair to David's right, like a man who never had to explain why he sat there. Then Klaus Richter, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, a laugh that filled the room before he'd fully entered. A small enamel pin on his lapel, his family firm's logo, 3 generations old. He clasped David's hand with both of his and said something warm in German. Marcus translated, "He says he's pleased to meet you and hopes the evening is productive." Elena, pouring wine, went still. That was not what Klaus had said. Klaus had said he was thrilled, that he'd been looking forward to this partnership for months, that his Munich team was already preparing. The difference between pleased and thrilled was a canyon. She told herself she'd misheard. She refilled bread baskets and listened. It got worse. Klaus spoke enthusiastically about European distribution terms, calling them generous. Marcus told David that Klaus found the terms somewhat aggressive. David's jaw tightened. Then the worst. Klaus offered a full exclusivity clause worth tens of millions. Marcus replaced it entirely with a fabricated concern about market saturation that Klaus had never spoken. Elena stood at the service station, hands trembling. She was a waitress making $11 an hour. She had a daughter and rent due in 12 days. If she was wrong, humiliation. If she was right, probably fired anyway. Rick Tavares would never forgive a server interrupting a corporate dinner. She watched David's face fall as Marcus delivered another poisoned translation. She walked to the table. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Excuse me." Steady. Quiet. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt. I could lose my job for this, but you're about to lose a lot more. Your translator is lying to you. He's changing everything Herr Richter is saying." The room stopped. Marcus laughed. "This is absurd. She's a waitress." Rick appeared, face white, stammering apologies. Elena didn't look at him. She turned to Klaus and spoke in German, fluent, precise, unhurried. She repeated what Klaus had actually said. The enthusiasm, the eagerness, the exclusivity clause Marcus had erased. Klaus leaned forward, staring at her. Then he nodded and turned to David. "Everything she says is correct, every word." Marcus's hand moved to his watch. His face went the color of old paper. In the silence, he stood, muttered something about a misunderstanding, and walked out. Rick was too flustered to stop him. By the time David looked at the empty chair, Marcus was through the front door. Klaus turned to Elena and said in German, warmly, "Finally, someone who actually listens." David stared at Elena. Every note in his leather folder was suddenly wrong, and the chair beside him was empty. David looked at the empty chair, then at Elena. Rick Tavares hovered near the doorway. "Can you translate?" David's voice was measured. "For the rest of the evening." Rick grabbed Elena's elbow and pulled her aside. "You are way out of line." "She stays." David hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm the client, and I want her at the table." Rick retreated. Elena sat down in Marcus's chair, still wearing her apron. Black polyester, a pen in the pocket, Sophia's bread roll pressing against her hip. She folded her hands on the white linen and tried not to think about the crack in her shoe sole or the fact that the man across from her was worth more than she'd earn in 3 lifetimes. Klaus began to speak. Elena translated, not just the words, the texture. Klaus spoke in long, layered German sentences that carried the directness of a man who'd built something with his hands before he'd built it with his name. Elena rendered each phrase with the precision of someone who'd spent years inside the architecture of the language, catching the humor, the subtext, smoothing the seams without losing the energy. "He's saying his Munich team has drafted preliminary logistics for European distribution," Elena said. "Full exclusivity, 5-year term, renewable. He says his father started this company in a garage in Stuttgart, and he only partners with people who build things the right way. He believes you are that kind of builder. David took off his glasses and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. He was recalculating everything he thought he knew. How long has Marcus been doing this to me? The question wasn't directed at anyone. It hung in the air like smoke. Elena didn't answer. It wasn't her place. She translated. For 2 hours, the dinner came alive. Klaus laid out the full scope, a $40 million exclusive European distribution partnership that Marcus had been quietly strangling. David asked sharp questions, and Elena carried them across the table in German that made Klaus smile, lean forward, and twice laugh with genuine delight. Klaus paused and looked at Elena. "Your German is remarkable. Where did you study?" Heat rose in her cheeks. "Just school," she said in German. "Should we talk about the delivery timeline?" By 9:30, David and Klaus shook hands on a preliminary agreement. Klaus turned to Elena, his voice low. "You don't just translate words, you translate meaning. That is rare." Elena managed a small nod and said nothing, because if she opened her mouth, she was afraid something other than words would come out. David walked Klaus to the door, then came back and pressed $500 bills into Elena's hand. "I need to reach you for follow-up translation. Can I get your number?" Her brain was running on fumes. Her instinct, the one that had kept her upright through every loss, was to keep things contained, safe. "You can call Brannigan's main line," she said. "They'll get a message to me." David nodded and shook her hand. Elena walked to the parking lot, got into her 12-year-old Honda, and sat in the dark. The $500 was in her fist. She thought about Sophia's field trip, about rent, about a professor who'd once told her she had the best ear for German he'd ever heard, and how that compliment had lived inside her like a pressed flower in a book nobody opened anymore. She cried, not loudly, not for long. The quiet kind that happens when something cracks open you've been holding shut for years, and you don't know yet whether what's on the other side is hope or just more of the same. She wiped her face, started the engine, and drove home. She had no way of knowing that by morning, everything she'd just saved would be used against her. Marcus Keller made the call at 7:15 in the morning. He'd barely slept. The tag Heuer on his wrist caught the light from his hotel bathroom as he scrolled to the number for Brannigan's Steakhouse and waited for someone to pick up. He didn't know yet that David Harmon would hire a forensic analyst. He didn't know about the wire transfers that would surface or the lawsuit that would follow. All he knew was that a waitress had opened her mouth at the worst possible moment, and that his scheme was bleeding out on the floor of a private dining room in Charlotte. His instinct was simple: eliminate the witness and buy himself time. Rick Tavares answered. Marcus identified himself as a senior consultant with Harmon Advanced Materials, technically still true since no one had formally terminated his contract. He told Rick that Elena's outburst had deeply embarrassed a major client, that the corporate account worth $60,000 a year was at risk, and that the situation needed to be resolved by noon. Rick didn't ask questions. Questioning a corporate consultant felt above his pay grade. Firing a waitress did not. 3 miles away, Elena dropped Sophia at school, feeling lighter than she had in months. The $500 from David was tucked inside a kitchen drawer at home, and she kept thinking about Klaus Richter's voice, the warmth in it when he'd said she translated meaning, not just words. She hummed the German lullaby on her drive to Brannigan's, windows down, the spring air blowing across her forearms. She clocked in for the lunch shift and was called into Rick's office before she'd tied her apron. He sat behind his desk with his polished loafers planted on the floor, and he didn't look at her. Not once. "Elena, effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. No discussion." She stared at him. "What?" "Unprofessional conduct. Harassing a client's guest during a private dinner." The air left her lungs. She understood instantly. Marcus. Marcus had gotten to Rick before she'd even woken up. "Call David Harmon," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking at her sides. Call him directly. He'll tell you what actually happened." Rick's jaw tightened. "I'm not bothering a CEO over a waitress." That sentence landed like a slap. Elena stood there for 3 seconds, absorbing it, and then she nodded once and walked out. She cleaned out her locker in the hallway, a spare apron, a tube of hand cream, the loose pages of her Gada, which she folded carefully into her bag. Danielle caught her at the back door, eyes wide. "They fired you. Are you serious? After what you did last night?" "It's done, Danielle. It's not done. It's wrong. You saved that man's whole deal and they—" "I did the right thing." Elena's voice was quiet, final. "I know I did. That has to be enough." Danielle hugged her. Hard. The kind of hug that says everything a person can't fix. Elena walked to her car and sat behind the wheel with the engine off. She did the math. Rent, $1,100 due in 12 days. Checking account, $640. David's cash tip, $500. No job. No health insurance for Sophia. No safety net. She pressed her forehead to the steering wheel and breathed. She didn't cry. Not yet. The math wouldn't let her. 2 days after the dinner, David Harmon sat in his office at Harmon Advanced Materials headquarters and watched a woman named Priya Nair destroy everything he thought he knew about the last 18 months of his company's international strategy. Priya was early 30s, sharp-eyed. With reading glasses, she pushed up her nose when she found something significant. Her legal pad was covered in color-coded annotations. Red for confirmed fraud, blue for suspected, green for verified clean. There was almost no green. 4 deals, Priya said. She laid the documents on David's desk with the precision of someone who'd done this before and understood that the numbers needed to speak for themselves. Tokyo, Milan, Sao Paulo, and the attempted Munich negotiation you just recovered. Marcus Keller altered key translation points in all 4. The 3 that collapsed resulted in combined estimated losses of $14 million in failed partnerships. David sat very still. His glasses reflected the overhead light. It gets worse. Priya slid a second folder forward. Financial traces show 3 wire transfers totaling $185,000 from a shell company called Bridgepoint Consulting, which is linked to Pinnacle Group. She paused. Your direct competitor. David's hand closed slowly around his pen. Not a flinch, not a raised voice, but Elena would have recognized the stillness, the same measured quiet he'd shown at the dinner table, the kind that meant a man was deciding exactly how much force to apply. He wasn't freelancing bad translations, David said. He was being paid to sink us. Systematically, for 18 months. David called his attorney that afternoon and authorized a criminal fraud referral and a $2.3 million civil lawsuit. Marcus Keller was unreachable, not returning calls, not answering emails. His consulting contract was formally terminated. Then Klaus Richter called from Munich. The deal paperwork was progressing well, Klaus said, and his team was enthusiastic. Then his tone shifted, the way it does when someone is asking a question they've been holding on to. "The waitress," Klaus said. "The woman who translated for us. Her German was university level. Better, perhaps. I've worked with professional translators for 30 years, David. She was exceptional." "What is her story?" David realized with a slow drop in his stomach that he didn't know her story. He didn't even have her phone number. She'd given him the restaurant's main line. He called Brannigan's. A young hostess answered. "I'm trying to reach Elena Vasquez. She's a server there." A pause. "Elena doesn't work here anymore." "Since when?" "I think, since a couple days ago? I'm sorry, I don't have details." David hung up. The timing was too clean. The night Elena exposed Marcus, she still had a job. The next morning, she didn't. He didn't believe in that kind of coincidence. He looked at Priya, who was still organizing her files. "She saved me $40 million, he said quietly, and someone made sure she'd pay for it. He pressed the intercom. "Find Elena Vasquez. Use Brannigan's HR records, payroll, whatever channel you need. I want her phone number by end of day." David's assistant found Elena's number through Brannigan's payroll records by the following morning. David made the call himself. Elena answered on the third ring, guarded. She assumed it was about a one-time freelance translation job. She even quoted him a modest rate, $60 an hour, her voice careful and professional in the way of someone trying to sound like they weren't desperate. David paused. Then he asked why she'd left Brannigan's. The line went quiet. Elena sat on the edge of her bed in the one-bedroom apartment she shared with Sophia, medical bills pinned to the fridge in the next room, and told David the truth. She'd been fired the morning after the dinner. Rick told her it was unprofessional conduct, harassing a client's guest, no appeal, no verification, gone by noon. David's jaw clenched. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't how he operated. But Elena could hear something tighten in the silence before he spoke again. Marcus called him, David said. It wasn't a question. I think so. David was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that Klaus had planted in his mind, the one that had been circling since the dinner. Elena, where did you learn German? You don't speak it like someone who picked it up casually. You speak it like someone who studied it seriously. She didn't answer right away. Through the phone, David heard a small sound, a breath drawn in, the kind that precedes something a person hasn't said aloud in a long time. I had a full scholarship, she said. UNC Charlotte, German literature. I was a senior. 8 credits from graduating, when my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. She told him the rest in pieces, dropping out to become her mother's full-time caregiver. 14 months of hospitals and bills, and a slow, terrible goodbye. Then meeting Miguel and Sophia and rebuilding something that looked like a life, until the scaffolding collapse that took Miguel and replaced hope with a different kind of math, the kind where you count days between paychecks and pray the numbers hold. I didn't quit school because I stopped loving it, Elena said. I quit because someone I loved needed me more. David sat in his office chair and stared out the window at the Charlotte skyline. He did the math silently. The $500 he'd pressed into Elena's hand at the dinner, the generous gesture, the rich man's thank you, was almost certainly the reason she still had an apartment. That cash tip had become her lifeline, and he'd had no idea. 8 credits. She'd been 8 credits from a degree that could have changed everything, and instead she'd spent the last decade carrying the weight of everyone else's emergencies on her back, reading Goethe on break behind a dumpster, whispering German lullabies to a daughter who thought the language sounded like music. David hung up the phone. He sat in silence for a full minute. Then he pressed the intercom. Set up a meeting in the main boardroom. Friday at noon, full executive team. A pause. And get Klaus Richter on video from Munich. He'll want to be there. Another pause. Longer this time. One more thing. Call Rick Tavares at Brannigan Steakhouse. Tell him we'd like to discuss the future of the corporate account. He'll come. Rick, eager to protect $60,000 in annual revenue, would say yes without asking a single question. And that was exactly what David was counting on. A week after her firing, Elena had applied to 9 restaurants. 2 called back. Neither hired her. She picked up 2 days of temp work through a staffing agency. Warehouse inventory counting at a distribution center off I-85, 12 hours total, $180 before taxes. She stood in a concrete bay with a clipboard counting boxes of industrial tubing and thought about how strange it was that her hands could do this and also parse the subjunctive mood in Schiller. Sophia asked why Mama wasn't going to the restaurant anymore. Elena said she was trying something new. Sophia accepted this the way children accept weather, completely, without follow-up questions, and went back to her coloring book. The financial walls closed in. Elena paid rent with her checking balance and David's $500. That left her with $40. She sat at the kitchen table after Sophia was asleep and stared at the number on her phone's banking app and understood something she hadn't fully grasped on the night of the dinner, that $500 tip, the one she'd cried over in her car, was the only reason she and her daughter still had a roof. Sophia's school sent home a notice about an unpaid lunch balance. $22. Elena folded it carefully and put it in the drawer with the electric bill. On Thursday, she drove to a community food pantry on the east side of Charlotte. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes, hands on the wheel, engine off. Pride and need pulled in opposite directions, and need won. Not because pride gave up, but because Sophia needed to eat. Inside, a volunteer, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain and a gentle, unhurried voice, handed Elena a bag of groceries without ceremony. No paperwork, no pity. Just a warm hand on her arm and the words, "We're glad you came." Elena's throat tightened so hard she couldn't speak. She nodded and carried the bag to her car. That night, she sat on the edge of Sophia's bed to read German. She reached for the Goethe, but the binding had finally given out. The pages were loose, fanned across her nightstand like scattered leaves, so Elena closed her eyes and recited from memory, the verses she'd carried for over a decade, the ones that lived in her chest whether she had a book or not. Sophia listened with her eyes half closed. "It sounds like music," she murmured, then quieter. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" Elena smoothed Sophia's hair. Her daughter had Miguel's eyes, wide and searching, the kind that saw more than a child should have to. "We are going to be better than okay," Elena said. "I promise." She meant it. She just didn't know how yet. After Sophia fell asleep, Elena's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She didn't recognize the number. "Elena, this is David Harmon." Her heart jumped. David's voice was warm, casual, almost too casual. He said he wanted to thank her properly for what she'd done at the dinner. Could she come to Harmon Advanced Materials headquarters on Friday at noon? Just a thank you lunch. Nothing formal. Elena was nervous, but she trusted David, and she had nothing left to lose. "I'll be there," she said. Friday morning, Elena stood in Danielle's kitchen while Danielle held up 2 blouses on hangers and squinted. "The blue one," Danielle said, "makes you look like you own things." Elena took the blouse without arguing. Danielle didn't ask why she needed it. She'd already guessed. Elena dropped Sophia at school, kissed her forehead, and drove to the Harmon Advanced Materials campus in Charlotte's South Park district. The building was glass and steel, 6 stories of clean lines and corporate confidence. She parked her 12-year-old Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW and sat for a minute, smoothing Danielle's blouse, rehearsing polite conversation. She was expecting a simple lunch. Maybe David would offer a freelance translation gig, a few $100s, enough to cover Sophia's lunch balance and buy another week. She walked through the front doors. The lobby floor was polished marble. Her patched shoes barely made a sound on it. David's assistant met her at the reception desk, a young woman with a kind face and a practiced smile. "Ms. Vasquez, Mr. Harmon is expecting you. I'll take you up." Elena expected a cafe, a break room, maybe a quiet office. Instead, the assistant pressed the button for the 7th floor and led her down a carpeted hallway to a set of double doors. The executive boardroom. Elena's stomach dropped. The room was large. A long conference table with leather chairs, catered food arranged on a sideboard, and a large video screen mounted on the far wall. Place settings lined the table. The room was empty but humming with intention, like a stage before a performance. Elena walked slowly to the head of the table. A small card sat beside a water glass. She picked it up. Her name, printed in clean script, Elena Vasquez. She touched the letters with her fingertip and felt something shift. The quiet, disorienting sensation of being treated as someone who mattered. The assistant appeared at her side. "Mr. Harmon asked me to tell you. Don't be nervous. Today is a good day." Before Elena could respond, the boardroom door opened. David walked in, followed by 3 men and a woman in tailored suits, his executive team. He nodded at Elena with a small, reassuring smile that told her nothing and everything at once. The video screen flickered on. Klaus Richter's face appeared from Munich, silver hair swept back, the enamel pin on his lapel catching the light. He saw Elena and his whole face broke into a grin. Then the door opened one more time. Rick Tavares walked in. He was wearing his polished loafers and a sport coat that didn't quite fit, and he looked around the room with the confusion of a man who had expected a routine meeting about a corporate account and found something else entirely. His eyes landed on Elena, then on the screen, then on the executives. His face went pale. Elena's breath caught. She didn't know what was happening, but she understood, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that this was not a thank you lunch. David closed the boardroom door. The room went still. He greeted Elena warmly, introduced her to his executive team by name, and gestured to the screen. "Elena, I believe you remember Klaus Richter." Klaus dipped his head from Munich with a smile. Then David's tone shifted. The warmth didn't leave, but something precise moved underneath it, the way a surgeon's voice changes when the procedure begins. "We're here today because of a fraud," David said, addressing the room. "A fraud that nearly destroyed a $40 million partnership, and because of the woman who stopped it." He pressed a remote. The screen split. Klaus on one side, a document on the other, Priya Nair's forensic report. David walked the room through it with the patience of a man who understood that evidence, delivered slowly, hits harder than anger. 4 international negotiations over 18 months. Tokyo, Milan, São Paulo, Munich. Marcus Keller had altered key translations in all 4. The 3 that collapsed before the Richter dinner represented an estimated $14 million in lost partnerships. David let that number sit in the air. $14 million. Then the wire transfers. 3 payments totaling $185,000 from a shell company called Bridgepoint Consulting, traced directly to Pinnacle Group, Harmon's competitor. Marcus hadn't been incompetent. He'd been purchased. David announced that Marcus Keller had been served with a criminal fraud referral and a $2.3 million civil lawsuit. Marcus was unreachable. His consulting license was under review. Pinnacle Group had begun distancing itself publicly. Then David turned to Rick Tavares. Rick had been sitting very still, his hands flat on the conference table, his polished loafers motionless on the carpet. He looked like a man trying to become invisible in a room full of people who could see him perfectly. "Mr. Tavares," David said. His voice was quiet, controlled, every word placed with care. "On the morning after that dinner, you received a phone call from Marcus Keller. He told you that Elena Vasquez had embarrassed a client and that Harmon's corporate account would be pulled unless she was terminated. You fired her that same day, effective immediately. No investigation, no call to me to verify. Is that accurate?" Rick's mouth opened. He looked at Elena. He looked at the executives. He looked at the table. There were concerns about... Is it accurate, Mr. Tavares?" Rick swallowed. "Yes." David nodded slowly. "You fired the woman who saved this company because the man robbing it told you to." He paused. Let the sentence fill the room. "I want you to sit with that." Rick's hands curled on the table. Heat crawled up his neck. He said nothing. "Harmon Advanced Materials corporate account with Brannigan Steakhouse, $60,000 annually, and is permanently closed, effective today." Rick stared at the table. The polished loafers that had always signaled aspiration now looked like a costume that no longer fit. David turned to Elena. His expression softened. The surgeon became human again. "Now," he said, "let's talk about you." David turned from Rick Tavares to Elena, and the room shifted. The steel in his voice softened. The prosecutor became something else, a man who had seen something worth protecting and had spent 3 weeks building the moment to protect it. "Elena," he said, "what you did at that dinner, stepping forward when staying silent was safer, risking your livelihood to protect a stranger's deal, told me more about your character than any resume I've ever read." Elena sat still. Her hands were folded in her lap, Danielle's blue blouse crisp against her wrists. She didn't trust herself to speak. "I've created a new position at Harmon Advanced Materials," David continued, Director of International Client Relations. The role involves managing translation, cultural liaison, and client communications across our European partnerships. He paused. I'm offering it to you. Salary, $95,000, full benefits starting in 2 weeks. The number landed in Elena's chest like a physical thing. 95,000. She made $11 an hour at Brannigan's. She'd done the math on $47 tip nights so many times the numbers were grooved into her brain. $95,000 was not a number that belonged in her life. The offer also includes full tuition reimbursement, David said, to complete your remaining 8 credits at UNC Charlotte. You were 8 credits from your degree, Elena. That ends now. Klaus Richter leaned toward his camera in Munich. He spoke in German, warm, deliberate, the voice of a man who chose his words like he chose his partners. Elena, he said, I want you as the exclusive translator for all Harmon-Richter communications. I have worked with professional translators for 30 years. I have never trusted one more than I trust you. Elena looked at David, at the executives, at Klaus's face on the screen, the enamel pin glinting on his lapel. She looked at Rick Tavares, still slumped in his chair, staring at nothing. She looked at her own hands, dry, cracked, still carrying the ghost of restaurant sanitizer in the lines of her knuckles. She tried to say thank you. The words came out steady at first. Professional, measured, the composure she'd built like armor over years of holding everything together. She thanked David. She thanked Klaus. She thanked the team for their time. Then her voice broke. 3 weeks ago, she said, I was reading Goethe on my break behind a dumpster. She stopped, breathed. I don't know how to hold this. The room went quiet, not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that happens when people are witnessing something real. I need to call my daughter, Elena whispered. She pressed her hand to her mouth, closed her eyes. And then she said the word. Yes. Klaus began to clap from Munich. The sound came through the speakers, slightly delayed, which somehow made it more real. Applause traveling across an ocean for a woman who had been invisible 3 weeks ago. The executives joined in. David shook Elena's hand, and his grip was firm and warm and unhurried. In the far corner of the room, a security guard appeared at Rick Tavares' elbow. Rick stood without being told twice. He straightened his sport coat, adjusted the loafers that had never quite carried him where he wanted to go, and walked out of the boardroom alone. Nobody watched him leave. Nobody needed to. The boardroom emptied slowly. The executives filed out. Klaus's screen went dark after a final wave. The catering staff began clearing plates, and David Harmon walked Elena to the lobby. He was quieter now. The CEO energy had settled into something more personal, the way a room feels after the music stops and the silence is better. They stood near the glass doors. Afternoon sunlight cut across the marble floor. David looked at Elena for a moment, as if deciding whether to say something he'd been carrying. My mother was a hotel maid, he said. She spoke 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. She never got the chance to use them professionally, not once. Elena looked at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The sentence explained everything. Why he'd tracked her down, why the boardroom had been orchestrated with such care, why this wasn't just business. David nodded, as if her silence was the right response. Go pick up your daughter, he said. Elena drove to Sophia's school. She parked in the pickup lane, walked through the front office, and signed Sophia out early. Sophia came down the hallway with her backpack bouncing and Miguel's wide, searching eyes. Mama, how come you're here? Elena knelt down in the hallway, eye level. Mama got a new job today, mija, a really good one, and I'm going back to school too. Sophia tilted her head. Will you still read me German at bedtime? Every single night. In the car, Sophia was quiet for a few blocks. Then, Mama, does this mean we're better than okay now? Elena laughed. The sound surprised her. It came from somewhere deep and untouched, a place she hadn't visited in years. Tears ran down her cheeks at the same time, and she didn't wipe them. Yeah, baby, we really are. That evening, after Sophia was asleep, Elena sat at the kitchen table. She spread out the medical bills, the electric bill, the school lunch notice. She opened her phone's calculator and typed a number she'd never typed before, 95,000. She subtracted rent, utilities, insurance, Sophia's needs. She stared at the remainder. The math worked. For the first time in 3 years, the math actually worked. She stacked the bills neatly, put them in a folder, and set the folder aside. Then she gathered the loose pages of her Goethe, the ones that had scattered when the binding finally gave out, and arranged them carefully, page by page, on the table. She would get a new copy soon, but these pages had kept her company behind a dumpster in an alley, and she wasn't ready to let them go. Across town, Rick Tavares walked into Brannigan's and told the owner he'd lost the Harmon corporate account. $60,000 a year. Gone. The staff who'd once stepped aside when Rick walked through the kitchen now watched him from the corners of their eyes, and what they saw was a man who had gotten smaller. Elena lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. She didn't want to. She just lay there in the dark, smiling at nothing, holding the feeling before it became ordinary. 2 weeks later, Elena walked into Harmon Advanced Materials wearing a new blazer. Navy blue, fitted, the first professional clothing she'd bought in 4 years. It still had the tags on it that morning. She'd cut them off with kitchen scissors while Sophia watched from the doorway and said, "Mama, you look like a boss." David's assistant met her in the lobby and walked her to the 6th floor. Down a carpeted hallway past offices with frosted glass to a corner space with a window overlooking the Charlotte skyline. Her office. Elena stood in the doorway and didn't move for a long moment. The desk was clean. A computer, a phone, a notepad, a nameplate that read Director of International Client Relations, Elena Vasquez. She touched it with her fingertip, the way she'd touched the place card in the boardroom. Her name, printed in a place that expected her to stay. The first weeks were steep. Corporate protocols, international communication standards, legal language buried in contract addendums. Elena studied at night after Sophia was asleep. The same fierce, quiet discipline that had once earned her a scholarship. She read contracts the way she'd once read Goethe, closely, carefully, with respect for what the words were actually doing beneath their surface. She completed her first solo translation of a contract addendum for the Richter deal and sent it to Munich. Klaus sent back a note in German. Flawless, as expected. She read it 3 times. She enrolled at UNC Charlotte for her final 8 credits. Evening classes Tuesdays and Thursdays. The first night, she walked into the German Literature Building, and the hallway smelled exactly the same. Old paper and floor wax, and something faintly like coffee. A decade collapsed into a single breath. Dr. Adler was waiting in his office. Late 60s, white-haired, reading glasses on a chain, the same worn tweed blazer he'd probably owned since before Elena was born. He looked up when she knocked, and his face changed. Recognition, then surprise, then something that moved through his eyes too quickly to name. "Elena Vasquez," he said softly. "Hi, Dr. Adler." He took off his glasses. "I always wondered what happened to my best student." He paused. "Now I know. Life happened, and you came back anyway." Elena's throat tightened. She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say more than that, and Dr. Adler didn't need her to. David checked in with her weekly, not micromanaging, mentoring. He shared how the European expansion was accelerating, how Klaus's trust in the communication pipeline Elena managed was opening doors that had been locked for years. He treated her like what she was, a professional who had earned her seat. On a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks into the job, Elena pinned Sophia's school photo next to her monitor. Gap-toothed grin, Miguel's eyes. Beside it, she placed a hardcover copy of Goethe's collected poems, a gift from Klaus, sent from Munich, with a note that read, in German, "For the woman who reminded me that words matter." She sat at her desk. The Charlotte skyline stretched wide beyond her window, and opened the book to the poem she'd recited from memory on the night the old binding gave out. The words were the same. Everything else had changed. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez walked across a stage in a black cap and gown and accepted a diploma from UNC Charlotte with hands that didn't shake. In the front row, Sophia held a handmade sign written in purple marker, "That's my mama." She held it with both hands above her head, gap-toothed grin wide, Miguel's searching eyes shining. David Harmon sat 2 seats away, quiet and still, clapping with the measured pride of a man who understood exactly what this moment had cost. And 3 rows back, Danielle, box braids, bright green sneakers, no apron, cheered louder than anyone in the auditorium. She whooped and clapped and didn't care who stared. 8 credits, a decade late. Done. 2 weeks after graduation, Harmon Advanced Materials hosted a company event to celebrate the fully executed Richter partnership, which had generated $12 million in first-year European revenue. The ballroom at the Charlotte Convention Center was full. Executives, partners, investors, and Klaus Richter himself on a large screen from Munich, enamel pin catching the light as always. David took the podium. He spoke briefly about the partnership, about growth, about trust. Then his tone shifted. "Tonight, I want to announce something that goes beyond this company," he said. "The Vasquez Bridge Scholarship, a fund providing tuition completion grants to single parents who were forced to leave college due to family emergencies." He paused. "Harmon Advanced Materials is seeding this fund with $500,000. Klaus's voice came through the speakers from Munich. "And Richter Manufacturing will match with 200,000 euros, because talent should never be wasted by circumstance." The room applauded. David turned to Elena. "I'd like to ask the woman this scholarship is named for to say a few words." Elena stood. She walked to the podium in the navy blazer she'd bought for her first day at Harmon, the same one she'd cut the tags off while Sophia watched from the doorway. She looked out at the room, the executives, the screens, the lights, and she told her story. Plainly, simply, the way the style guide demanded and the way her life deserved. The scholarship, her mother's cancer, dropping out, Miguel's death, the restaurant, the dinner. She told it all without performance, without pity, without raising her voice. "This fund isn't named for my accomplishment," she said. "It's named for the gap I fell through, so that others won't." She paused. Her eyes found some middle distance beyond the room. "Someone once told me I was just a waitress." She let the sentence land. "But a waitress is someone who pays attention, shows up, and serves. I'm proud of every shift I ever worked." The room was silent. Then it wasn't. Afterward, the news made its quiet rounds. Marcus Keller's civil case had settled at $1.8 million in damages. His consulting license had been permanently revoked. Pinnacle Group had severed all ties with him publicly. He was never seen again. His destruction was complete, documented, and impersonal, filed in folders and court records, not in anyone's memory. Danielle found Elena by the coat check. She pulled her into a hug, the same hard, full hug from the day Elena had cleaned out her locker, and whispered into her ear, "You were always too good for that place." Elena held on. She closed her eyes, and she let the words land where they'd always been true. 1 year after the dinner at Brannigan's Steakhouse, Elena sat in her corner office on the 6th floor of Harmon Advanced Materials. Late afternoon light came through the window in long, warm sheets, turning the Charlotte skyline gold. On her desk, Sophia's latest school photo. She was 9 now, the gap-toothed grin unchanged, Miguel's eyes as wide and searching as ever. Beside it, the framed photo of Elena's mother, and next to that, the hardcover Goethe from Klaus, its spine already softening from use. Elena closed her laptop. She'd just finished a video call with Klaus about a new Austrian partnership she was spearheading. Harmon's European revenue was on track to double within 2 years, and Klaus had spent the last 10 minutes of the call bragging to his colleagues in Munich about his translator. Elena had deflected the way she always did and redirected to the contract timeline. Some things didn't change. She packed her bag, turned off the desk lamp, and drove to Sophia's school. The after-school German language class let out at 4:30. Sophia had insisted on enrolling, not because Elena pushed her, but because she'd grown up hearing the language every night and decided it belonged to her too. Sophia climbed into the car with her backpack and a worksheet covered in conjugation exercises. "Mama, I got Sprechen right on the quiz." "Of course you did." They drove home to a new apartment, a 2-bedroom with a small balcony and Sophia's own room. The walls of Sophia's room were purple, chosen by Sophia with the seriousness of a Supreme Court decision. The fridge had food in it. The electric bill was paid. The medical debt was on a manageable plan for the first time since Miguel died. At bedtime, Elena sat on the edge of Sophia's bed. The purple walls glowed faintly in the light from a small lamp shaped like a star. "Mama, sing the German song." Elena smoothed Sophia's hair, dark like hers, thick like Miguel's, and sang. The same lullaby, the same one she'd whispered into a phone from a grease-smelling alley behind a steakhouse, sitting on a milk crate too tired to stand. The same one she'd recited from memory the night the Goethe binding gave out and the pages scattered like leaves. The same melody, the same words. But everything around them had changed. She sang it now in a warm room, in a stable home, to a child who no longer needed to ask if they were going to be okay. Sophia's eyes drifted closed. Her breathing slowed. And then, half asleep, in a murmur so soft it barely stirred the air, she said, "Gut Nacht, Mama." Elena's chest tightened, not with grief, not with worry, with something she'd almost forgotten the shape of. "Gut Nacht, mein Schatz," she whispered. She kissed Sophia's forehead, turned off the star lamp, and walked to the balcony. The city stretched out below, lights and highways and buildings, and somewhere, blocks away, a steakhouse, where a woman had once read poetry on her break and wondered if anyone would ever hear her voice. Elena stood in the evening air and held the moment. She didn't need to name it. She knew what it was. It was the sound of a life that finally matched the woman living it. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that speaking the truth, even when it costs you, is never wasted.